Hi all. These are generally conversations between adults after the children have left the table. The language can be spicy and the subjects can get saucy. So if you're ready, this is the Southern Fork. Unscripted kitchen chats and also studio chats with some of the most interesting voices in the culinary South. I'm Stephanie Burt, a food and beverage writer based in Charleston, South Carolina, who travels with her fork to write for a variety of publications, from magazines you might have on your coffee table to the website you love to visit for your favorite recipes. And I'm inviting you to come behind the scenes with me to get to know the people who make this Southern culinary landscape so special. I'm always hungry for the next bite, thirsty for that next sip, and ready for the next conversation. Let's dig in. The Southern Fork is honored to be presented again this year by Townsend Automotive in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Celebrating 50 years of service in Tuscaloosa and West Alabama, the Townsend family of dealerships has been a locally owned company built on service and connection with its customers. At Townsend Honda, with new cars in short supply, they've purchased more than 200 quality pre-owned vehicles. And every one of them goes through a 118-point inspection before it's offered for sale to you. Most of those vehicles are either Honda Certified Pre-Owned or Townsend Certified Pre-Owned, and the dealership also has a fully staffed parts and service department to assist you beyond the purchase day throughout the life of your vehicle. That includes Saturday service, which is available until 1 p.m., even during football season. Visit townsendhonda.com for current inventory, or if you're in West Alabama, stop in. Townsend Honda salutes local entrepreneurs, from restaurateurs to podcasters, and they welcome you to be part of a community that does the same. Most food tours in the U.S. involve quick stops at multiple restaurants, but in Charleston, South Carolina, there's one that's very unique, led by a chef and certified tour guide with a passion for the history of Lowcountry foodways. Undiscovered Charleston is the brainchild of Forrest Parker, a chef whose restaurant tenures include Opryland, Lewis's, the Old Village Post House, and Revival. A former 2016 South Carolina Chef Ambassador, Forrest has a cookbook collection that spans 3,000 volumes and 3 storage units. And that's not including his extensive collection of old restaurant menus from the Holy City. He weaves history, architecture, and plenty of good food into this intimate walking tour that ends in lunch. And it's rated the #1 most popular food experience in the world on TripAdvisor. Walk a morning with Forrest, and you realize that his encyclopedic knowledge of Charleston restaurants, past and present, is directly connected to the city streets themselves. And he's weaving his own story into those old cobblestones with every tour. Welcome to the Southern Fork, Forrest.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, we've only known each other for a prehistoric age at this point, I feel. So
You go back a ways.
Yeah, but I'm so excited. Got to spend most of the day with you and a group of strangers walking around the city and then eating together yesterday. And so I wanted to come back today and spend a little time chatting with you. We've chatted many, many times over the years, been in a lot of the same circles, the heirloom grain, the history, the Charleston foodways kind of circles, but also wine dinners and all kinds of other stuff. So how many years have you been doing this now?
Well, I started just prior to the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the best time in the world to launch a new business.
Especially travel-based.
Exactly so. And then, of course, South Carolina is one of the last states to lock down and one of the first states to reopen. And then coming back from lockdown, there's the same sort of mistakes and trying to avoid pitfalls you've made before and rebuilding. But hopefully I'd made most of those mistakes on the front end. And then just some gradual rebuilding, and it's been really organic. And because the experience is so intimate, I mean, I cap at 10 guests because that's what I can fit comfortably. Mm-hmm. Because of that, I don't really hype it up. I don't do a lot of advertising. And so it's really gratifying that the successes so far have been organic.
Well, and it also helped that it was small groups and outside when things opened back up here. So I've always known you as a chef, and I almost said something negative about carriage drivers yesterday during our tour, and I'm glad I didn't, because that's how you started your career here in Charleston at College of Charleston when you were attending. That was back when, for those of you that don't know, Charleston had a licensed tour guide program, and it's extremely extensive. And so you did that, and that's the foundation for Undiscovered Charleston, right? And then you mix in your foodways.
In many ways, it's how I developed as a cook, because my experience as a tour guide and my passion for Charleston and its history and its diverse peoples, no pun intended, but that kind of seasoned how I developed as a cook over the years.
I use all the culinary puns on this show. Okay. We embrace those. Seasoning, delicious, digging in, all that stuff. Yeah.
And then when I came back, I was working as a tour guide in college as a carriage driver, and it was a slow season, so I had to pick up some hours on the side to keep the lights on. I didn't have a lot of cooking experience, but I had a little. And it was enough for me to get my foot in the door with Chef Louis Osteen. Mm-hmm. And so it's really Louis who I first credit for putting me on my path in the first place. And it's a really interesting time here in 1997, because there's the beginning of this groundswell that we would see. And there were amazing chefs, Louis Osteen, Donald Barrickman, Frank Lee, were all really at the height of their game and doing amazing things. So when we opened Louis's, for instance, we would cure and preserve our own duck confit. We made all of our sauces, soups, stocks, everything from scratch. And really we're doing it right. And I took a lot of pride in what we were doing. But when we made, for instance, Louis's famous dish of crispy preserved duck confit on creamy grits with Madeira red-eye gravy, which I will never forget that dish. It was so delicious. But the grits we were using were Quaker quick grits. Because that's what there was. Right. And
Anson wasn't around yet.
Not yet.
Anson the restaurant was, but not Anson Mills. Yeah.
Not yet. And so there was none of the proliferation of farm to table anything. It was really difficult to find locally raised and milled grits. Carolina gold rice we'd heard about, but you really, it was difficult to find. And if you could, it was probably cost prohibitive to serve in a restaurant.
Yeah.
And so fast forward, I mean, in many ways, I feel like I'm a chef that's got one leg literally in two different millennia, because now we've got this proliferation of locally raised and milled sources, and we continue to have the fundamentals of a great cuisine here. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of whether or not the kids want to engage with it, I think.
Well, you've definitely engaged. I think in some ways you're the nerd of the nerds. You're the king of the chef nerds here, as far as just in general. And I say that with the highest praise, because I am also a nerd. And I have a cookbook collection as well, but mine is vintage community cookbooks, because I really like to see these women hidden under men's names, and these things that were cooked in a chafing dish in the 1970s at a cocktail party. I like things like that. But you have a huge cookbook collection, and you've already named a few chefs. And then here, yesterday, you're talking about all these people that we're standing on the shoulders of, and this idea of a lot of people coming before you. That can be really intimidating. And you've gone from a huge staff. I mean, you were an executive chef of big kitchens to cooking in front of 10 people. How do you deal with that intimidation? Was it freeing to think about all these people ahead of you that are helping you, and from cookbooks to your mentors, or was it a little creatively just a little catatonic?
Well, if anything, to me, I think it felt like validation because I started to, for the first time, have an understanding of where I fit in with all of this. And I think for a lot of us, we can struggle, not just in culinary, but just in life. We can struggle with trying to figure out where we belong. Mm-hmm. And so because of my background,
note that you have to sing in the choir, basically.
More or less. I mean, because of my background as a tour guide, I was so passionate about the history of Charleston. That, seasoned how I develop as a cook. And then I got some chops working with Lewis and moved off and worked in some really big places up north and out west. Was exec chef at Opryland through the flood in 2010. And then came back here in 2011 and worked with Frank at the Post House for 5 years. And so everything kind of comes full circle. And I started my blog just as a means of staying connected to my industry. I didn't know what I was writing about. I just, if it interested me, I wrote about it. If not, I didn't. And then the word is Governor Haley found the blog, and I guess she thought this is interesting, a chef that likes to read and write. So I got the phone call naming me a chef ambassador for the state, which was just incredible. It's so humbling. And
that's a program that's still going on today, very successful with the certified South Carolina Department of Agriculture program.
And that's just it. I mean, Charleston for me has always presented itself as very much a community. Mm-hmm. And I feel strongly that whether it's the community of chefs that came before me or the community of chefs that are here now, there's always been a lot of competition here, but there's also always been a lot of collaboration.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's never been more important than bouncing back from a global pandemic when the whole model of restaurants, I think, has been seen by many as untenable. And so to have such incredible passion and interest in town, where you see these collaborations and pop-ups going up all over the place. The food hall model that they're doing over at Portical on the market is fantastic.
I learned a couple things on the tour yesterday, and I did not want to admit that because I'm supposed to read more than you. I'm a writer. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some iconic Charleston dishes. This is a tour where you get to learn history and then you come back and you eat history on a plate. And I wanted to focus a couple things on the shrimp and grits. I liked your story and I liked talking about how that was a breakfast dish. Can you expound on that a little bit, Jeff?
Well, I think one of the earliest recipes I've seen for the dish was entitled Breakfast Shrimps and Hominy. And it was basically shrimp cooked with bacon and served on top of grits. And so one of the things I try to do with the cooking demo, for instance, is to show, I always try to pull from the iconic dishes of the Lowcountry, and I always try to source locally and cook in season, and have some fun along the way. So even if it's the same dish one day to another, it might be different iterations of that dish from different times or different versions from different restaurants. But I try to draw the arc to allow guests to better understand how we get here today from where some of these dishes originate. And so a dish like shrimp and grits, which is so iconic in Charleston, starts out as a breakfast dish. And in the collection of menus that I have that go back into the 19th century, there's no shrimp and grits anywhere. People weren't eating this in a restaurant because if you're in a restaurant, it's a special occasion.
Right. That's a home dish. And also seafood and especially shrimp, it wasn't cooked like that in restaurants. You wanted a nice steak or a lobster or something.
I think so. That's what I see on the menus. Mm-hmm. It's funny to look at these old menus because there'll be an 8-ounce fillet for $1.50 or a whole Florida spiny lobster for 65 cents. And guests will get a chuckle out of looking at that. But then there's no shrimp and grits. Mm-hmm. And other iconic dishes. She crab soup doesn't really happen until 1909. And there's a lot of tradition and story that goes with that, but there's also some scholarly debate. And I know my friend Robert Moss is kind of digging more specifically into the history of that dish. Mm-hmm. But there's still a lot of tradition tied to it. And so I like to be able to touch on that and show guests how they can make some of these own dishes at home and try to get them to engage on their own. Because I think as Americans, we become very much like Puritans in that we're obsessed with the idea of food and cooking, but so many of us have become terrified of the act of actually cooking something.
Because it takes practice and you're going to mess up.
And that's how you learn. Make mistakes.
Exactly. But the idea of going back to this thing of shrimp and grits and building different elements of the dish and then putting it together, That's a chef thing because there's a term called a la minute, but I have to think that this history has informed your palate and also made you enjoy food more. What was the first dish that you were like, I'm going to trace the etymology of this and I'm going to find what this dish is?
Probably any number of the rice dishes. I mean, so much in Charleston goes back to rice and rice culture, the complementary crops that were grown in association with rice, the methods of growing rice, all the different strains of rice that were grown here. There's so much of that. And so there's a great book written by Karen Hess where she reprinted the Carolina Rice Cookbook that's, only a handful of copies are known to exist from the early 20th century. And in there, she traces anthropologically the nature of some of our dishes like perlo, and she connects the dots and draws that line back to West Africa, to Southern Europe, Sephardic tradition, across the Mediterranean, and even as far back as the Persian Empire. And I'm like, with one dish right there, you've gone halfway across the globe and all the way back in time to the Persian Empire that ends with the death of Darius III at the hands of Alexander the Great.
Yeah, well, that's a long way for a kid from Anderson. I mean, it's a way to travel. I've always thought about it as a way to travel, but I think a lot of listeners will hear our conversation and there's an intimidation feeling of like, well, we want to have it this way. I like cheese in my grits. Can you address that? Because a chef is also about reinterpreting and creating new dishes. I mean, we had shrimp and grits yesterday and there was Parmesan cheese on it, which was delicious, and you used a blowtorch to toast it. It was lovely. Does it have to be just like the olden days to be authentic, which is such a loaded word, by the way?
I don't think so. I mean, with the cooking demo, I'm trying to touch on all these points, and to show guests how they can make them at home. But as a chef, I mean, one of my many criticisms of our industry is that we seem to have bred a generation of tyrants in kitchens. And to me, it's all hospitality. It's about making people happy. And I can follow a set of directions, but that's not going to necessarily make somebody feel more comfortable. Mm-hmm. And it's about making people comfortable, making them happy and full. And that's what I've always liked to do. And so as a chef, I've always said for years, the answer is yes. What's the question? And so I might put my spin on it. Somebody else might want to put goat cheese on their grits. Yeah, and as misdirected as I think that might be, because I can't stand goat cheese and that's just me, then I'll put goat cheese on it. It's about making people happy.
Looking back at these menus and how I just think about this because I'm a researcher. I was an American Studies instructor before you never even knew that, did you? Before I was a food writer, and I understand the power of research. And so do you go on eBay? Do you hit all the attic sales? I mean, at certain points, like the President Taft menu that I was able to touch yesterday that had one of the creators of she crab soup was the chef of it. Where are you getting this stuff? Give me some insider info here.
Anywhere I run across it. I mean, it's, I look for stuff on eBay or similar auction sites. I'll set up alerts so that if something comes open that hasn't been there, the Taft menu, that was big bucks, but there was no way I could pass that up because frankly, it needs to go to a museum. But I'm always looking. I'm always studying and absorbing, and whether it's an old historic cookbook, whether it's some sort of digital resource, and there's so many great collections of digitized menus at the New York Public Library.
Oh my gosh, that menu collection is
it's
epic.
Huge.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
And you can just click around and see it. Yeah.
So I mean, I'm always looking at stuff, fragments of things that I run across. And then anytime I hear a reference to something that, if it's a source I haven't heard of before, then I get excited. And, anytime, I think Dr. David Shields publishes pretty much anything out of the University of South Carolina, I just get excited.
Yes. He's, has been an expert voice in many of my articles and on this podcast, but you're also taking people around. And I think that you and we have good conversations because I'm always observing. Like yesterday when you were like, look at this thicker brick here, you're pointing out architectural details. And things like that. Do you read people on the tour as well? Do you see their reactions? How are you being? Because you were a chef ambassador. You're an observer. You're a scholar. You're a cook. And you're also hospitable. So you got to get away from that wall, that kitchen wall. This isn't a place that a lot of chefs want to stand, by the way. They don't want a table touch and stuff.
You do just kind of get a sense of what guests are passionate about. And it's, not everybody's the same. And some people get more, excited and wired for what we're doing than others. You get some guests that come on the tour that are completely on fire. I had a couple of guests come on the tour last week that after the tour, we ended up just sticking around talking for an hour and a half. To me, that's so gratifying and so incredibly humbling to be able to share this city with guests that are that fired up about it. But other guests come along and, they want to see some pretty houses and they want to eat some delicious food. And that's perfectly okay. And I'll deliver that to them. But if people do get excited about any kind of one thing, then if I can enhance their experience and give them just a little bit more, to me, again, that's what hospitality really is.
It's an invitation too. And you can choose not to take that invitation. You can just sip your wine and eat your boiled peanuts and have a fine old time. But if you want to ask questions, you can, right?
Yeah. And that's, it really kind of develops into this sort of natural conversation along the way. And so no two tours are ever the same. And even if it's the same dish, there'll be different iterations. My problem in Charleston isn't what do I cook and what do I talk about? It's what do I not cook and what do I not talk about? Because there's so much here. Our history is so rich, so diverse. It's so frequently tragic, but the cuisine that results from all of that is so delicious. And I think that's what we need now more than ever.
Does this look like what you thought it would look like, Forrest? Because I remember when you decided to do this.
Yeah.
Because it's a big deal to leave a professional kitchen, It's a big change. Yeah.
But I've been cooking professionally almost 30 years. And I tell folks, I'm like, in all of that time, I've never been so excited or enthused or on fire as to say, this is what I was intended to do. And finally, in the way I was intended to do it. I hope to grow it and I hope to offer other similar food-based deep dives. And so what I'm doing now, I can see is the entry-level 101 level class. And then, if we want to do some other deeper dives into the history of the Huguenot influence in Charleston history, or the Dutch, or certainly the Gullah Geechee influence, all of those are delicious. And I think they're all in need of further sharing.
Well, that answers that first question. What is making you hungry? I'm guessing expansion, doing something bigger.
Eventually, but I don't know. It's so gratifying to do what I do now for just 10 guests a day. And in a way, I think in terms of expansion, I'm my biggest problem because I'm going to be hard pressed to find a tour guide who can cook or a cook who reads history books. And so in that sense, I think that's one of my biggest challenges, but it's also what makes this so unique.
But they're out there. It's that Rumi quote. What you're seeking is seeking you. So I'll leave that.
And if they're out there, they can reach me at undiscoveredcharleston.com and we'll have a lively conversation.
That sounds great. What is one aspect of this job that you literally created for yourself that meshes like a perfect puzzle piece with an aspect of your natural personality?
Hospitality. There's no question. Hospitality. It just means the world to be able to share the city with guests in the way that I fell in love with it and to share some of these different delicious dishes. I didn't want to do the model of the 3-hour 6-restaurant tour where there might not be any kind of connecting narrative. I had a pretty specific vision in mind of what this looked like. And the problem with it was that the model didn't seem to exist. And I've done food tours in Italy, in New York, in Seattle, and San Francisco, but I've never quite seen this model. And I always say, when I was a kid, if history class involved food, I would have paid so much more attention.
Yeah.
But it's the most gratifying thing. And then to interweave that with such a personal sense of hospitality, because I'm cooking, I'm serving, I'm pouring. We've got some help from some fantastic guys, Matisse and Joe and Andrew helping me out. So it's lovely to have them along, but it's so personal. It's such a personal expression. And I think that guests for the most part really appreciate that.
Yeah. It feels like you're cooking for them because you are, and it's almost like they're at your house. It's very quiet in here. It's just a small bar. It's a tucked in place. It just feels very personal and like I walked you around. I showed you some things. Now I'm going to cook for you.
And I think part of the magic of that is the space we're in itself, the Bistro Avant, because it's so small and intimate and has such incredible charm. I mean, we're here in this building from the 19th century that survived the 1886 earthquake. You know, when we come back here, guests have seen the different earthquake bolts and they know a little bit about this history. And we walk up and they're like, "Oh, this was in the earthquake." I'm like, "Yep, sharp eye. Good job."
Yeah, that's cool. They're learning. What's one thing keeping you up at night?
Generalized anxiety disorder. You know, as an entrepreneur, it's just there's not enough hours in the day. And it's on paper, it's a half-day experience, but every day is still a chef day. I mean, every day is still 12, 14, 16 hours. Some of the aspects of it, of what I'm doing, come more naturally. I mean, the cooking is easy. It's natural. It's what I'm excited and passionate about. Holding myself accountable and making the time to sit down and do the due diligence, you know, the follow-up, the admin work. Anybody who's ever worked with me can tell you that's not my strong suit. Yeah,
wow. Creative. Yeah, I get it. All right. So you've fed me so well through the years. I mean, I don't know how many times I've had your food. Multiple times. I am thrilled to be able to welcome you to the family of Southern Fork guests. And part of that involves this question, which is, I have a magic picnic basket and I am able to time travel with this picnic basket. I'm able to ask anybody to make just one more bite of something you'd like to try. I can source for you and I can cook a little bit. Now, as chefs and cooks and just generally obsessed with this world that we both are a part of, I know that shifts and changes on the day, can shift by the hour of what you're craving, what you've been thinking about. So what are some things I can put in that basket today for you?
Well, when we talk about that personal sense of food memory and the really epic moments I've had in my life eating things. So many wonderful things I've eaten over the years and so many great chefs and places I've been able to eat and dine. But there's those standout moments. And I remember the first time that my friend Josh Ivey and I went to dine at Latasha's Taste of New Orleans, which for years sat on the corner of Cannon and maybe St. Philip's or Cumming. But Robert Pinckney for years had this restaurant, Latasha's Taste of New Orleans. And there were red and white checkered tablecloths. And there was a big sliding door Pepsi glass cooler. And it wasn't filled with Pepsis. It was full of beer. And if you wanted a beer, you got up and you got it. And you opened it on the side. And at the end of the meal, they counted the bottles up. Robert's pork chops, his collard greens, and his mac and cheese are on my death row, not death row meal. And, you know, cooking years and years and years later, there's those moments where you really taste something where you're like, man, I wish I could cook like that. And the local kids would say when something tastes insanely good, it's because someone dipped their toe in it. Mm-hmm. And if it's off the rails good, it's because they stuck their foot in it. Well, I think at Latasha's Taste in New Orleans, I think Robert Pinckney was putting both his feet in it because that stuff was stinking delicious. And there's so many of these restaurants. I mean, people talk about historically black colleges and universities, but nobody talks about historically black restaurants. Mm-hmm. And there have been so many of those I've enjoyed over the years, and they seem to be getting fewer and further between. You know, I think the idea of holding on to those and helping support those black businesses is so important, not only for them, but for us as a community, because that's such a pillar. Some of my most memorable experiences and taste associations go hand in hand with that. Yeah. We lost Martha Lou last year, and she retired and just a few months later had passed. And so now if you've driven up around there with all the new construction, her pink coral little building is encroached on by all this new construction and is covered, surrounded by big construction trucks. And it just looks like it's about to fall in on itself. And to me, it's astounding because in a city that's so widely known as a food destination, and with the resources of like the James Beard Foundation and the Charleston Wine and Food Festival, if we can save Julia Child's Kitchen and move it to the Smithsonian Institution, to me, it seems egregious that in a city that's the epicenter for historic preservation in the United States, that we can't save one simple coral building and the murals that are on the outside and the inside of it.
Good point.
It's probably more than you asked for. But.
Oh. All right. On that note, if you'd like to learn more about Undiscovered Charleston and my friend Forrest Parker, who is a wonderful chef and made those shrimp and grits that are on my Instagram, and it's a rare moment when Stephanie posts shrimp and grits, you can go to thesouthernfork.com. I'm going to have links there as well as images so you can see the face behind the voice. If you like what you hear, well, there are more than 300 episodes in the archives, including with 3 people. Well, Dr. David Shields that he mentioned today, definitely with Frank Lee, who I mentioned today, and I didn't get Martha Lou, but I do have the ladies at Bertha's Kitchen. So thanks so much for taking the time and for feeding me so well. It's a pleasure to spend time with you.
Thanks for coming along and digging in.
Yeah. Hello and welcome to Talking with My Mouth Full. You heard me mention in this interview that you just listened to that I was an American Studies instructor, and during the interview, Forrest raised his eyebrows. He did not know that, and that's what I'm responding to in this. And I bet a lot of you didn't know that. It's in my formal bio, but I mean, who reads those, right? So, I wanted to talk a little bit more about it because I think it's one of the seeds, maybe the first real professional seed that was going to sprout as the Southern Fork. I was very, very fortunate to teach at UNC Charlotte under Dr. Paula Eckerd, who was one of my mentors and is just such a wonderful, inspiring college professor. And I taught a couple classes and then also developed a couple for the program. But one of those classes that was already established was a class called Growing Up Southern. And it really attempted to tackle the cultural specificities of the Southern landscape. And that was a pretty big task for a budding academic like me, but I went for it, and we discussed a lot of things, from the plantation household to blues music. And then, of course, I did a whole unit on food. So even back then, and we're talking the very, very late 1990s and maybe the year 2000, I was making biscuits. I've made biscuits since high school for my family. And so I would do things like talk about biscuits and buttermilk and quick bread and soft wheat and all of that history connected with soft winter wheat, which lends itself to quick bread. Anyway, I digress. And I would bring in fresh biscuits and a whole bunch of mason jars filled with heavy cream or whipping cream and pass those out to students, and we would shake them until they churned into butter and then have butter and biscuits. I also took students on a voluntary field trip to a very old school that was still owned by its original owners, Meat and Three, where my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, had their first date. I remember I was blown away when one of the young women in my class, and remember, I wasn't but a few years older than all of these people, when I saw her and she saw that there were pickled beets on the menu for that day, and she goes, "All right, I loved pickled beets." I just basically sat there for a second with my mouth agape. I didn't know anyone my age who ate pickled beets. And of course, I make pickled beets now. So that's a long way of saying I learned as much from my students as they learned from me. And it was a wonderful experience, and something that I've kept in my back pocket all these years that has helped me in both writing and in doing something like the Southern Fork. So thanks so much for listening and being a part of my journey today. And I hope that your journey was pleasant while you're cooking or driving in the car or, folding laundry. We all know when we listen to podcasts. So thanks so much for taking the time to listen to this one. And I will be here next week. You've been listening to The Southern Fork. I can't wait to bring you more culinary conversations, but in the meantime, I have one question. Are you gonna eat all that?